Hi, my name is Fenel Doshi, and on behalf of my collaborators, Rag Palin and George Alvarez, I'd like to welcome you to our poster, Using Deep Convolutional Neural Networks to Examine the Role of Representational Similarity in Visual Working Memory. So, we were interested in this broader question of how can we link neurophysiology to perceptual psychology? And in the context of vision, when light falls on the retina, how does the neural response in the visual cortex lead to perception? Having this link would be super useful to come up with biologically plausible cognitive models and explain different types of underlying constraints, like capacity limits in higher cognition. But there are a number of different challenges in this domain, feasibility being one. To test any hypothesis, we might have to collect neural responses, which could be single site or fMRI data, for all the stimuli that we're going to use in our behavioral experiments. And this might seem to be logistically a bit difficult. An additional challenge, which is even more complex, is how do we capture and manipulate relevant feature dimensions? A lot of experiments in perceptual psychology are currently limited to low level vision, with oriented gratings where we can parametrically vary features like contrast, orientation, and frequency. But what about images that are associated to these mid to high level regions of the visual cortex? How do we even describe what the relevant feature dimensions are? Could it be animacy, size, curvature, or maybe a combination of some of these? But overall, the point being that this high level feature space is just so vast and complex that it makes it super hard to systematically control the stimuli. So, here we describe an approach that we developed to address this issue of doing psychophysics of mid level vision. And as part of the first step in this pipeline, we synthesize stimuli that can predict neural responses in the high level visual cortex. And for this, we use a deep convolutional neural network. Previous work has already shown strong evidence that these deep nets, which perform image categorization with human level accuracies, are also able to capture significant amount of variance in neural data. So the artificial neurons from these models can be mapped to neural sites in the visual cortex, giving us access to these CNN brain mapped encoding models, which can now predict how much a specific image would fire the corresponding neural site. But the functionality of these encoding models is not just limited to its predictive ability. Given that they are end-to-end differentiable and image computable, gradients from the mapped model can be used to synthesize stimuli that would perhaps activate different neural sites in the actual brain. We then quantify the representational space occupied by these synthesized images, which lets us access and systematically sample the stimuli from it. We can then just go ahead and test if the quantified neural space lets us predict certain perceptual effects using different behavioral paradigms. So we use this three-step approach of image synthesis, quantification of representational space, and behavioral experimentation and demonstrate its functionality using a case study of change detection for visual working memory. We first leveraged this V4 encoding model made available by Bashivan and colleagues to resynthesize 52 stimuli that would maximally activate and fire 52 neural sites in the macaque V4. Once we generate these images, we subsequently sort out to quantify the representational space comprising them. And just to first remind you, even though each of these 52 images maximally drive a specific site, it still activates the remaining 51 sites to some extent. So we actually can imagine a 52-dimensional space in which each image can be thought of as occupying a specific position. Once we map each of the images' position in the space, we quantify the representational geometry by simply computing the Euclidean distance between every pair of images, which is represented in the RDM over here. As our case study, we then wanted to explore how representational similarity influences visual working memory. There are existing theories that posit that information across levels of the visual processing hierarchy are represented on these two-dimensional maps, and when items occupy locations that are far from each other, each of these items are remembered well. But in contrast, when items are close to each other, their activity profiles overlap, leading to destructive interference, manifesting as quote-unquote cognitive limitations. To test this theory, we had participants complete a 2 AFC change detection task, in which they were presented with an initial memory display comprising 3 of these images that were randomly sampled, followed by a brief retention period, after which on 50% of the trials an item showed up again, and this item was identical to the item in the memory display that occupied the same location. But on the remaining trials, the item changed in identity. And the important thing is that for these change trials, the post target could have been either near or far in the representational space relative to the pre-target item. These near and far scenarios appeared with equal probability, and participant was then given 2 seconds to respond whether or not they detected a change in identity. Examples of the pre and post change identities for both the scenarios can be seen over here. And it's important to note that these stimuli are not easily categorizable and that near change pairs are not necessarily perceptually more similar compared to the far change pairs. So what do we find? Taking a look at the accuracy for all the change trials, we can compare percent correct for items whose pre and post change was near versus far in the representational space, and we found that the change direction accuracy was indeed higher when the pre and post change items were further away in the representational space. In case you're just curious, we also found a difference in response time for change trials, where participants took longer to respond when items were near in the representational space, suggesting that these accuracy results do not simply reflect a speed accuracy trade off. But looking at performance collapse across all trial types, we do not really find a significant difference in accuracy across change and no change conditions. So yes, we found that the representational similarity between items in the space that we just quantified directly influences visual working memory. But whether or not this effect takes place at the storage, encoding, or decision-making level still remains an active area of exploration. In conclusion, the main takeaway here is that this three-step approach that we discussed today provides us the means to systematically map neural space to perceptual space. Moving on, we want to first test and apply this approach to other paradigms such as visual search. But more importantly, we are now interested in isolating different levels of representations in the visual hierarchy and eventually exploring fine-grained characteristics like tuning and center surround profiles of stimuli in behaviorally relevant feature spaces. With that, I'd like to thank you for dropping by our poster.